Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I want to make sure we can see the screen share. I get a thumbs up. I only see Eve there, so you see the screen okay?
Yep, we see the screen.
Okay, right on. So thanks, everybody, for being here. My name is Julian Kaspari. I'm a co-founder of CDARC, and I'll be hosting and moderating the conversation today. As people trickle in, I wanted to share a quick overview of the speaker series and quickly on CDARC. So first, CDARC is a technology company producing tools that empower the ecological community to accelerate our most promising climate solution, restoring healthy ecosystems. If you're interested in learning more about us, Blaine, maybe you can move the slide forward one, please. Thank you. If you want to learn more about us and the tools that we're building, please visit us at cdarc.io. Sign up for this series, sign up for the newsletter. We'd love to be on this journey together with you. Please feel free to follow us on Instagram, and specifically on the CDARC Instagram channel, we'll be posting demand signals for tree and shrub seed this year, as well as related job opportunities that are happening and available throughout the season. Today's session is the first in what we intend to become an ongoing conversation with people engaged in the restoration ecology and reforestation industries around the world. And we hope to support an ethical, accessible, and inclusive global community of practice around this work. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of you for making the time to be here today. We hope you'll get something meaningful out of the session. And on that note, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, offering your name, where you're from, and maybe your favorite species. We'll get to the land acknowledgement in a second. Awesome, I see Eduardo's on as well. Welcome. So I'm Julian, I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and my favorite species is Eastern white cedar. So for today's sessions, we're going to hear from three incredible speakers representing seed movements from the Pacific Northwest to the US Northeast and Brazil. We'll leave time at the end for some Q&A, so please post your questions in the chat as we go. Before we begin, we wanted to offer a land acknowledgement. Now, we first heard this land acknowledgement at the National Native Seed Conference hosted by the Institute of Applied Ecology and BLM. And personally, it really spoke to me. And I guess I've been noticing how land acknowledgements often fall flat and stop at acknowledgement as opposed to driving towards action. So the land on which we're hosting today's event is the ancestral and continued home of Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that the violence that led to their displacement and recognize that there is much work to be done to rectify our relationships and to prevent future harms. We honor and value the long chain of knowledge acquired by Native peoples, honed through time, relationships, and experiences living with the land. We appreciate and respect Indigenous knowledge holders, recognizing this way of seeing the world can help us develop new eyes upon the land, which we now share. We ask everyone in attendance today, no matter where you are in the world, to consider where you are in this context. Who were and are the Native peoples that lived and live on the land you inhabit and work? And if you're unfamiliar with this, we encourage you to get curious and learn about the traditional ecological knowledge where you live. We also want to recognize that many things are asked of our Indigenous neighbors, and this is not their burden to bear. So if we want to become more fully educated about where you live, be open and patient with yourself and with those around you. Education is not equal to a Google search, nor is it your knowledge to own or share. It takes time and reflection to come to understand, and we hope that in your process, you're able to develop enriched relationships with Native neighbors and ideas. We also ask you to uplift Native peoples and think about how you can contribute to their power, wealth, and health. Please consider making a donation today to groups that support Indigenous people, and even better, reach out to initiate business relationships, community relationships, and personal relationships. So with that, let's meet the speakers. I'm so thrilled to have these thought leaders, industry leaders, pioneers in the seed space with us today. So first, we will kick it over to Eve. So Eve, what are you up to today? How did you come to this work? And what keeps you engaged and motivated moving forward?
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so excited to speak on this panel.
So I have a background in natural resource conservation. I've worked on a lot of different projects in many different places around the world. I was working on the conservation of crop wild relative species for a while. And then I found myself as an urban planning student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I was really getting into green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and finally ecological restoration, but realized that these interventions in our built environment, which are intended to help us adapt to climate change, the planting palette is often very limited in both species diversity and intraspecific diversity. And when I started to look into this, supply chain issues became glaringly evident that this was the reason why. And so I used my thesis research there to do a social network analysis of supply chain actors in the Northeast United States. And I studied the interrelationships among those supply chain actors, which resulted in really interesting insights that then helped me find myself in my current position as a program director at the nonprofit organization, the Ecological Health Network, which focuses on advancing and scaling up ecological restoration. And we've been taking those insights and working on catalyzing and coordinating a very large multi-sectoral network across 13 states in the Northeast United States. And what motivates me is, well, I get to work with lots of different people. I get to work with botanists, farmers, ecologists, gene bank curators, nursery professionals, and I'm working with people across all of these different states, and everybody I work with is so passionate and dedicated and committed and cares so deeply about biodiversity and wielding biodiversity to help heal our ecosystems and slow down climate change. And that's what keeps me going.
Thanks so much, Eve. We're super inspired by the work you're doing at Nesson and beyond, and mobilizing grassroots communities and actors and creating such an amazing, intentional, and inclusive space. So thanks, Eve. Matthew, what about you? What are you up to today? How'd you come into this work? What keeps you motivated and hopeful moving forward?
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, Julian, Blaine, thanks for putting on this event. I think these types of events are something that hopefully is going to cascade into more and more awareness for kind of those adjacent to our business. Why I say that? Well, because I spent 20 some years working in, reforestation, native plant systems. And, I did this as a practitioner, as a scientist, working in the nonprofit public academic space. And, most recently I joined a private enterprise, and partly because I was demoralized and the lack of incentives for the hardworking people along the supply chains to actually scale this up. And being absolutely cynical at this point, I think that there isn't a path forward unless we can figure out how to find those incentives and meetings like this, sharing information, catalyzing ideas, but also looking at information gaps is kind of where my focus is. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to kind of be a voice of reason on some experiences that have led to me skinning my knees on the supply chain and scaling up. And I'm excited to take some questions from folks and get into it effectively.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. And you're very humble in your introductions with your international experience and footprint and what you're building today. So I'm excited to dig in on some of those supply chain questions and see what we can learn together.
Awesome.
Eduardo, over to you, my friend. What are you up to today? How did you come into this work, and what keeps you motivated and hopeful?
Thanks for the opportunity. Hello, everybody. I am recovering from fall today.
Oh, no. So sorry.
No problem. And I got in this area in the year 2000 when my father asked help for me to restore the native forest on the family farm. And I was just graduating in biology here in the University of São Paulo in Brazil. And 6 years later, I started working in the nonprofit that I work today, which is called Instituto Socioambiental, and started using direct seeding, and then we had to source a lot of seeds, and then that led to the formation of networks of seed collectors on indigenous villages, small farms, settlements, and nowadays we work in a strategy called Redario, where we help to develop 25 different networks of native seeds in different regions of Brazil. And very happy to be here and part of this discussion.
Thanks so much, Eduardo. Excited to hear more about how those networks came about and how they were seeded and who's involved going forward. So let's get into defining the seed crisis. What we have learned in the research is that globally, the UN estimates 3.8 trillion pounds of native seed are needed to restore 3.4 billion acres. And this is in the context of almost 40% of our terrestrial land being degraded. In the US, the BLM estimates that it needs 1 billion pounds of native seed to restore 120 million acres. And staggeringly, this is 20 times what the BLM has purchased in the last 25 years. So lots of progress needed in the US. And then in Canada, we've heard varying reports on how many seeds are needed to plant 2 billion trees, anywhere from 11 billion seeds. We've heard recent projections from the Forestry and Conservation Authority and the government of BC between 4 and 6 billion seeds. Regardless, we need a lot of seeds to plant 2 billion trees in Canada. So there is a need that we're seeing. And the question that I wanted to bring to the panel, if we can flip to the next slide, is there a seed crisis? Do you see this happening in your world? How is it showing up? And what's going on? So why don't we start with Matthew on this one? Is there actually a seed crisis? What are we facing here?
Yeah, I mean, it's all relative. So it depends on the user, in my experience. So my answer is absolutely yes, unequivocally, there's a seed crisis. But if you were to go to a timber producing region and talk to a forester that's in an area that has been well resourced for developing plantations, you typically will find a nice integrated economy around that wood product. You will find orchards that produce seed. You will find seed banks that produce, that have in their banks quite a bit of orchard produced seed and wild collected seed from populations that are relevant to timber supply. And they may have a 50-year supply because as fiduciaries managing a timber operation, that's their responsibility. Now, that is not universal because, as we all know, those timber operations are slowly divesting from areas where they've cut and productivity is lowered, where the climate is changing, and where mills are no longer there for them to derive a revenue model that makes sense. And so increasingly, as we move outside of those areas, and I'll use the Western, US as an example, I could say Western North America, but I'd love for some Canadians to chime in. As you move into the interior, you find that there's actually a vacuum for the species that we need to restore to a baseline that is any relativization of a historic ecosystem. Whether that's something you want to put a 50-year point on or a 500-year point on, we just don't have those seed reserves in our seed banks. And I'll throw a few numbers out here just to relativize how big this problem is in just Western North America. So west of the Mississippi, there are primarily conifer-dominated forests, of which 90 conifer taxa dominate the canopies. In our seed banks, we probably have represented about 20 consistently. And that does not accommodate the seed zones that are distributed across that Western region that allows us to actually hone in on the correct provenance to correctly do restoration and have longevity in these systems. And that omits the fact that there are 600 or more angiosperm taxa that we need to be incorporating into these systems because they're fire resilient, they provide all sorts of structure to the forest and biodiversity. And none of those are really represented in seed banks outside of maybe an ephemeral cycle of 1 to 2 years. And for the seed nerds in the room, it's because of the dormancy mechanisms that disallow that type of forward planning. Without the ability to immediately put that seed into action in a nursery and in a planting operation, there isn't a functional demand signal and incentive, and therefore a reduced availability of that seed. So it depends on the user is my summary, but for most of us who are interested in large landscape restoration and the global crisis that we're facing, yes, there's absolutely a seed shortage.
Thank you, Matthew. Eve, what are you seeing in your world in the Northeast of the US?
Yeah, we have a seed crisis here. We have a breakdown in the supply chain. Although we have a lot of people that are working on it currently, I think what I see and what I'm coming to realize more and more, that it's not just a seed supply crisis, but it's a supply and demand crisis. And I'd like to underscore that to solve this crisis, we have to really ameliorate asynchronous supply and demand. And that requires developing tactics and strategies that we can, make sure that we have the right seed in the right place at the right time, but also that we have systems in place for caring for that organism so that it can help to rebuild the composition, structure, and function of the ecosystems we seek to restore. And it's challenging, and Matthew pointed out, the issues with seeds being able to be stored in orthodox methods, or if they're recalcitrant, which adds a lot of complexity to making sure that supply can adequately meet the demand. So yeah, I would say we have a crisis and it's complicated.
Thanks, Eve. Yeah, thank you for bringing, both of you for bringing the systems level piece and also the challenge around biodiversity. Matthew, you sort of mentioned that a little bit. Eduardo, what are you seeing in Brazil and in the communities that you're working with? Would you consider that you're in a local seed crisis, or what's happening in your world?
There is a communication crisis because seed suppliers have more seeds to sell than the market is buying, and the demanders in the market can't find the seeds they need. So there's a big misunderstanding through the native seed production chain, and that's the crisis when it happens, because a lot of restoration projects that consume native seeds are rushed and don't have an anticipated planning, and can't figure out how much that will cost and guarantee that budget and make contracts. So the seed suppliers can't grow and invest and it's growing because they don't know what the demand will be this year, next year, the other year. So there is a lot of insecurity in growing, because you don't know if you're going to sell those seeds. So I think it's a communication crisis. There is no lack of seed at all. Plenty of seeds. You just know who is going to buy and who is going to get it.
Great, thanks, Eduardo. So I want to sort of dig in here a little bit further as we're looking at the larger systems piece and communications around supply. Eve, knowing that you're working with Nessun in sort of a grassroots organic format, like what are some of the things that you guys are doing to stitch together the supply chain and help to build solutions?
So a lot of my work over the past 2 years has been facilitation of bringing people together in workshops and convening meetings and thematic committees. We've been doing a lot of outreach and engagement and stakeholder identification. My thesis research was helpful because it was a first step in identifying kind of the larger constellation of all the different types of social actors that are engaged or have stakes in strengthening both the supply and demand side of the chain. And it was also helpful for identifying that it's not just individuals or groups or agencies, organizations working on the key supply chain steps, but social actors that play really important intermediary roles that are working on, research that can be fed into the supply chain as well. So a lot of the work has been bringing those types of diverse social actors together and trying to identify what are the priorities, what are the needs, where are there the gaps. And, one of the things that we feel as a big accomplishment is the development of a target taxa list. So we brought 28 people together over 5 months of meeting on a pretty regular basis to think about what are kind of criteria that we want to apply to prioritize species that we can then focus on the collection, the storage, and the amplification. And that's been a learning process too, because we recognize that that list isn't, a one size fits all for the entire region, but we're trying to hone in on what are those common species across the region, whether that's 15 or 20, that now we can start to understand what are the protocols that we need to develop for scaling up these species, where are there gaps to focus on collection and banking. So it's an iterative process. We're learning all the time, but I'm starting to see, I think, the threads really starting to connect, and that we've been building this capacity, and now we're starting to have real impact to actually strengthen those key steps of the supply chain.
Great, thanks, Eve. And I really see what you guys are bringing together is like a constellation approach that's mobilizing many actors, and we see a little bit of that happening also where we live in Ontario with the Southern Ontario Seed Strategy, and that intermediary work and convening work is really so powerful. Matthew, you talked a little bit about developing reserves, and specifically, that there is a bounty of about 20 species, but there are 90 which make up the biodiverse forests west of the Mississippi. Can you speak a little bit more about how you're responding to that and what that looks like and what's missing in the current workflows?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it all comes down to the divestment from these rural areas in the Western American interior. When there was an extraction in industry and economy, the cut and run or cut and manage systems created networks of service providers, ecosystems, if you will, of service providers in these local communities in the interior West, as they were cutting trees or managing forests to a revenue objective that was nearby and near term. And that money catalyzed a variety of kind of trickle down effects to sustain a variety of efforts, whether it was seed collection, secondary wood products, watershed management, cultural systems management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's many things I'm not listing that are there in terms of timber and then non-timber forest products, and the communities that were deriving revenue from them, in monetary form or other. And as these kind of primary economies exited, basically so did our opportunities to have any sort of continuity or longevity in income and incentive or funding, however you want to frame it, to be able to do all these trickle down activities. And as a result, majority of these communities suffered majorly. So, many of the loggers who were part of the extraction industry were no longer taking paychecks locally, so they had to move to other industries or go belly up. A lot of families left, went to centralized urban areas, looked for other industries. And unlike coastal economies, when there was divestment, there wasn't other industries necessarily to go to in shipping or fisheries or whatever. So in these dry areas, like, we really lost not only sort of the incentive to stay and invest in, you know, diverse seed collection among the many other things that requires to be a steward of a forest. But we lost basically any sort of cultural knowledge that went with these individuals that left. And this has also been exacerbated by the fact that majority of the tribal groups in the interior regions were left with landscapes that were lower productivity. And if they weren't tied to these, you know, national, federal, industrial systems that were more or less creating subsidized ways for them to manage their resources and drive revenue, then they too suffered, and it limited their ability to work with their cultural systems and cultural plans. So now rebuilding that functionally comes down to creating a new incentive structure, a new economy. But how do you do that in Western North America when productivity rates are low and carbon schemes currently are beating the hammer of ton per acre in order to make an impact and bring money back to those landowners and those communities, right? So we're in this really challenging inflection point right now where we're trying to figure out how economies of scale around carbon as a gateway to other mechanisms in the future, hopefully like biodiversity being valued, can create an incentive structure that reinvests money into these communities at the landowner level, whether it's, you know, small mom and pop, public, private, tribal, or every industrial, non-industrial owner in between. You know, we're trying to figure out how to basically capitalize, you know, their ability to manage forests for non-timber needs. And that should in turn create incentives for us to be able to have meetings like this with local communities, have knowledge transfer start to leak into these areas to champions that will ultimately pick up the torch and say, I will start to, you know, look at the botanical needs of collection, the banking needs of collection, and start from bottom up. So if I'm being perfectly honest, to summarize, I'm not very optimistic that we're going to incentivize this right now as fast as we think we are. But I am optimistic these conversations are happening in the periphery and starting to close in on these areas. And it's really important to me that, you know, we figure out ways to create sustained approaches, because there's a lot of profiteering happening. I mean, I'm coming from a private company, right? So feel free to finger point and point to my hypocrisy, and I will take that challenge on and try to answer your questions. But I truly believe that there needs to be incentive structures that can trickle down, and that profiteers are ephemeral, meaning they're temporary, right? And we need to be operating in systems like seed collection knowledge and forest development that is decadal, right? Century long. So how do we create a through line that is beyond us? And I think that's a change in psyche. Like, we need to start thinking about forests like infrastructure, the way we do road systems, sewage systems, you know, and a variety of other things that societies invest in for the long term. And hopefully this is just the edge of these conversations happening, but yeah, you know, we got a long way to go in my opinion. Sorry, that was a long turn away from seed, but like,
awesome.
Hopefully my point
really,
coming across.
Really great reflection. Thank you, Matthew. I love the point about infrastructure, and we'll get into the incentive piece shortly.
Mm-hmm.
But first, before we go there, Eduardo, you talked about more of a communication crisis as opposed to a seed crisis. So I'm curious, like, what are some of your ways of engaging with your 25 regional seed groups, and how do you start building that communication bridge more effectively to address the larger challenge?
The easy part is to engage with the 25 seed networks. And then hopefully until the end of this year, it will be 40 seed networks. That's the easy part, to understand what they can produce of seeds, which species, how much should it cost. So we organize this information, like this tax list that each seed network can deliver, and when and how much it costs and all that. And the hard part is to talk with the demanders of those seeds, whoever is going to buy those seeds, and also to understand their demand. We usually go through technically analyzing which species and how much they are thinking to buy, and to help they consolidate their demand. And then our strategy is to work like a network, not only for exchanging knowledge and do's and don'ts, and how to attend to the regulations, and how to identify the tropical species that we have 30,000 different species. And but not only for that type of exchange and cooperation, but also like a network for selling seeds. So that way we can attend different regions and different projects, getting different seed networks together in order to deliver seeds adequate to each project. In that way, we can look at present climate, future climates, and think of good mixes, more resilient, and benefiting the projects with a good genetic variability and adequate for adapted seeds for each place, and also benefit and creating stability for the seed network, so they all can sell some seeds every year and don't have big fluctuations. One year selling a lot, another year selling nothing, and that breaks those initiatives. And so it's very important to give this stability in order for those seed networks to keep steady and also keep perhaps grow on its native seed production. So the network selling strategy is also very functional for us.
Great. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that, I mean, you are building many of these pieces of the infrastructure from the ground up, and creating incentive and communicating that incentive that drives behavior. Maybe we can hop to the next slide, because that's a really good segue into our next question, which is, we were talking about starting from the ground up in some places, in some geographies and regions. We're talking about evolving supply chains, evolving decades old timber production realities. But yeah, we want to talk a little bit about, what are the greatest drivers and incentives for change in the industry? And Eduardo, you mentioned a number there on the riff around communication and guaranteeing buyers and setting prices that are respectable for people to engage. But I'll head over to Yves on this one. Like, what are you seeing in your world? What's driving participation? What is driving people into a grassroots network like Nessun? And there's another organization which I believe you're launching as well, which you might want to offer on the demand side.
Well, yeah, so the new partnership is the Restorative Landscape Coalition, which was just recently launched in February, when we actually brought botanic garden seed banks and arboreta and other allied organizations together to see how they could leverage their experience, their resources, many projects that they're already working on to strengthen seed supply chains in our area, to support the Northeast Seed Network. But what emerged out of that convening workshop was that we need a coalition, we need a campaign to help build better markets and strengthen those demand signals for very high quality seed and plant material. And I think, where I see levers for change is, again, this idea of bringing lots of different groups of people together. Matthew made a very astute observation that we're going to need a change in psyche. And as many, with many of our very complex environmental and social issues of our century, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, nor is there one organization, entity, or institution that can solve these complex, complicated problems. And they really require that exchange of thought and idea and resources among domains that have been previously unconnected. And I think this can help generate novel solutions and enable that collective action that we need across conventional boundaries. So I see that, you know, it's important to do this work, but it's also challenging, and there are lots of transaction costs that we need to consider as well. You know, it's challenging to get government agencies to work with the private sector sometimes, and nonprofit groups to work with, you know, private companies, and, you know, some people are speaking really very different languages. So the role of the intermediary is important also to help leverage change.
I love that. And had the pleasure of sitting in on your annual meeting. I believe that was in December for Nesson, and got to hear some incredible stories from folks in your network. And in following up with them, many of them said, like, yeah, markets are the solution, and having this like social glue is something that's very meaningful and keeps people connected. Matthew, when you're talking about you know, you sort of talked a little bit about incentives just a minute ago, and specifically, you know, MAST is using carbon as an incentive to engage private landowners to plant long-term forest ecosystems. We've, you know, start talking about carbon credits. We talk about biodiversity credits. What are some of the other incentives from a private perspective that you guys you're seeing with MAST?
Yeah, I mean, I think at every level it's different, right? There's I mean, we get these ebbs and flows of policy initiatives, social pressure, and, you know, federal money. And right now we're at this interesting inflection point, at least in the US, with the Replant Act and the infrastructure bill providing a heap of money through grant programs throughout the country for incentivizing best practices at the landscape level. Now, there are professional grant seekers who are grabbing this, and there are a lot of nonprofits out there that are those professional grant seekers, and we hope that they are doing the right thing to create a foundation for these landowners and stakeholders, so that once the money hits, the activities are pursued, the knowledge is transferred in addition to the materials, the goods, and the activity on the land. The difficult thing is we actually lack experts that understand the functionality of a lot of the things that are being funded. So a lot of this funding is effectively subsidizing learning curves for all these organizations, even ours in some cases. We have a lot of young employees that are you know, building their knowledge base, their capacity to do stewardship, you know, within our enterprise. And like, it's the same for the majority of the people that are bringing these grants on. So incentives is a really complicated question when you start to work adjacent to a market, right? And then there are traditional markets like timber, you know, and other, again, non-timber forest products that are managing landscapes. And, you know, those are mechanisms by which, you know, we can kind of work towards this, work away from the center. So where there is a timber economy, you know, a lot of these landowners seeing, oh, forest biodiversity and resilience in my or neighboring property is actually good for me too, because it insulates me from risk in the future. And they are starting to subsidize this knowledge and this better behavior in the supply chains about, you know, diversity of species, diversity of activity on the land in the form of land management. So I don't know that I have a very pointed answer. It's more ethereal.
Yeah, very, very systems level. And yeah, I like the echoing of Eve's comment about cross-sectoral partnerships across private, public, nonprofit spaces, and the capacity building piece to get more familiar with what needs to be done in order to build this from the ground up again. Eduardo, you spoke to some incentives in your piece around communications. I'm curious, like, how do those 25 regional networks get launched? What's the incentive for them to get going? Is that initiated centrally, or are people coming to you because they see that there's a need and they're wanting to act on it, or how is that being initiated and incented?
Those 25 seed networks started for local opportunities where there was a clear demand for seeds, and they were mobilized for delivering those seeds. And after some years, those projects ended, and then they become like orphans, and then they come to us to ask for help. And that usually is help to find buyers, but also help on different aspects. So like I said, plant identification, how to attend to the regulations, how to plan the seed collection, pricing, how to administer to the resources, and how to store seeds, all the technical and organizational aspects that we can help them to develop. So, and they also want to know who are their peers. So what are the other seed networks? What are the other seed collectors in Brazil and in their regions then they can connect to and rely on? So to create relationships that also can help them to find their ways on each problem that arises.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, we had a comment also in the chat from Naren. Thank you for this, but basically saying, the forest industry is well resourced and has an adequate amount of softwood seed, but it doesn't resource hardwoods because they sucker and are not as high value. So seed shortage and hardwood seed, no investment, no seed. I think that really rings true from what we've heard. And it sort of like brings up, there's investment in an industry that's rolling and profitable, can be expected, but how do we incentivize investment in new industry and new opportunities? And how do we invest in solving our ecological crisis that we sit in, and how do we solve the investment in biodiversity as well? And Matthew, I'm not sure if you've had any brushings on that larger question from a systems perspective.
Can you help me refine the question? Because I tend to be rambling, as you guys have noticed.
Yeah, have you seen investment?
Perfect.
Have you seen like high-level institutional investment in biodiversity to solve our ecological crisis, or do you see most of the money just going to industry where industry is showing return?
Yeah, so it's the latter, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't know how familiar folks are with kind of these carbon schemes and these biodiversity schemes and their status. So allow me to just, briefly provide like some overview. So with carbon, the biggest problem in our sector is proving something called additionality, meaning any activity that you're going to do is going to create accretive or net additional carbon. And by proxy, that means, a more healthy, resilient, or robust growth of a forest into the future. So whether that's like proving that your reforestation activities are supplementing an area that would not have otherwise naturally regenerated, or whether your forest tending activities are reducing biomass to release forest growth and accumulate carbon, or anything in between, right? Proving that requires a variety of complexities, including something that the acronym MRV is being used: measurement, reporting, and verification. So you need to be able to basically prove that there's additionality, and do this cyclically so that the people that are buying the offset and paying for all of this in the other side of the marketplace actually have confidence in that market, that product, et cetera. There are 130 different carbon credit types, right? And no one can necessarily agree on the type of methodology. So there are different reserves, and all of this stuff is being communicated and learned and iterated on by professionals on all sides, right? And there's a whole lot of hand waving about people that are carbon experts and biomass experts, and there are very few of them because it's a new market. So if anyone tells you they're a carbon or biomass expert, I would question the credential. Now let's move on to biodiversity. Like, biodiversity is a really, well, I mean, all of you who work in the field will know, much more complicated thing to measure, right? So how do you produce additionality there in your MRV, right? And there are technologists and scientists and others that are working on these pathways, like, for instance, acoustic monitoring to see if they're hearing more species, genetic screening, where they do these tests of the soil or the surface conditions to see if there's, the presence of DNA of a variety of species, so eDNA basically, or just good old-fashioned monitoring. Send a bunch of birders and mammalogists and other people into a site and look for this. But if we're talking about restoring biodiversity, what is our control, right? What are we comparing or contrasting to? Is there an adjacent landscape that's healthy? Does that exist functionally in our fragmented systems of the Northeast, or our wide open degraded systems of the West, after these 1 million acre wildfires like the ones we had in interior Canada? We don't know. So we have biodiversity markets forming. Europe's been pioneering. There are some murmurings of this taking off in New Zealand, which is a very compliance-based system, meaning as opposed to voluntary purchases of these types of offsets, they require them in their markets. So like, we have the initial systems forming, but I suspect it'll be 5 to 10 years between now and when there's an inflection point of the technologies being valid in most world systems, and where the markets have matured to a place where we actually have an ability to measure, report, and verify this so that we can put it into a monetary system that's robust. But for now, it's a bunch of us who are going to be skinning our knees trying to develop these systems, and we have to decide whether we want to gatekeep and make sure there's high integrity at no cost, or whether we want to let some of this happen and maybe skin our knees a little bit and have some blowups and collapses in the meantime, right? And so which approach is, is unclear to me, and maybe there's a middle ground.
Okay, thanks, Matthew.
Yeah.
Looking at the time, we're going to move to our last question. We're going to make this a lightning round question, so we can get to audience Q&A. So we're going to look for a very brief answer, could even be a one-word answer. What's the most significant supply chain bottleneck, in your opinion? And if you had a magic wand, what would you fix for the greatest impact? Why don't we start with you, Eve, on this one?
I think we have bottlenecks of time and resources. If I had a magic wand, I would give all the people I work with 20 extra hours a week to just focus on building the capacity of the 2 partnerships that I help to coordinate.
Thanks, Eve. And Eduardo, what's your take?
Well, I would give to all the seed collectors anticipated orders of the demand of native seeds that they need to collect for the next 5 years. That would solve so many problems, and all those orders would be with fair contracts, with prepayments, and then we would have good seed analysis on laboratories with good and fast protocols, so that we can sell the seeds with those analyses on time.
I said one thing, Eduardo, but I appreciate all of the offerings. We're just going to do the entire supply chain. Matthew, what about you?
Sorry, my English is not very good.
No, it's great. I'm reading it totally. Thank you. Matthew,
pie in the sky. Sorry, I've been a downer probably the whole meeting, but like, I will say that if I was being an idealist, I would say everyone should be rallying for a policy initiative to go and get their governments to subsidize seed collection, full stop. Seed is expensive, it's onerous, and it doesn't make sense for businesses to collect and basically model revenue systems on, because you can have boom and bust cycles that'll kill your business, right? Whereas full seed banks benefit everyone downstream. So if the government decided to do anything beneficial, it would be to basically subsidize all retailers to go out and collect and do that at a wage that is livable in those respective regions. It's a matter of national security as far as I'm concerned. It's a climate security issue.
Love it. Thank you all so much for those reflections. The chat is open for any questions from the audience, and we're happy to take them. One of the earlier questions that came up from Sebastian was around labor. And Eduardo, you sort of pointed to this a little bit around having demand signals 5 years in advance, ensuring, I'm not sure if he said ensuring payments to seed collectors, but clarifying pricing. How do we bring more labor and more collectors into the mix? Matthew, you just mentioned how do you subsidize it and support it with government? But Eduardo, what does that look like in Brazil? How do you bring more people into the mix?
You get a greater demand, then you have more seed collectors. It's easy as that.
Yeah.
Our community, it's weird for us to use the term industry, as was in the previous question, because seed production in Brazil is 99% done by community-based networks. So so there are a lot of people wanting to collect seeds, but they can't get into because the market is buying few, not so much seeds. So if you got a bigger demand, you have more people in Brazil.
Yeah, daylighting demand is such a huge piece. We had a great question here from Andrew. What's the best way to educate seed buyers or clients to pre-order and secure seed? Matthew,
I've got to take on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so masting is a really complex thing that we haven't quite figured out everywhere. So the best way to work with buyers for us in the Western continent is effectively start checking in right around November and then keep that conversation up through May as we get out for scouting and collections. Because if you're able to tell your collectors, your nurseries, and ultimately the plant buyers roughly what's coming, you can create a demand stream that incentivizes everybody to go out and take the risk on a collection. And doing so in a way that timing allows for them to execute on these kind of like awkward windows where we have to have everything lined up. This is harder for state actors that usually plan their budgets on like bienniums, right? But for all the private contractors and collectors, like this is totally how we've been running it. In fact, we look back at the Silva seed records back into the 1930s, and like that's always how it's been. So we haven't evolved that strategy yet. Maybe the Squirrel app or other solutions will allow us to improve those communication pathways. But ultimately, it's just getting people in network that do this to have these conversations, and it's a very insular market.
Thanks, Matthew. We had a question from Kimberly around working with shrub species rather than trees. And so how do we create a functioning community with biodiverse species, grasses, forbs, shrubs, trees? Eve, what are you seeing in the Northeast US when it comes to representing fully biodiverse groups of species?
Well, I would say we're working on figuring that out. I'm engaged in a project right now with the Nature Conservancy's New York chapter and the Department of Environmental Conservation and many other groups of people representing, parks and gene banks and independent botanists. And we're developing a target taxa list for reforestation efforts, and we're thinking about how do we include shrubs and vines. And we've made also the point that it's important to include herbaceous understory plants as well, but we're just focusing first on identifying what trees and shrubs and vines we want to include in this list to help stimulate commercial production. This list will help scale up saplings and plant material, seed material to help restore up to 1.7 million acres, about 700,000 hectares of land across New York State to help meet the state's climate neutrality goals. And, it's just complicated. It's challenging, but we're trying to first identify what those tree species are and then what the tree compatible species are to make sure that we have more biodiverse reforestation plantings.
Great, thanks, Eve. So one thing that Eve, you mentioned about waving your magic wand, you would get more time. I think we've talked about time and demand and forecasting demand and how do we create this time machine so that we can eliminate that lag and or improve the time lags around demand in the market. Does anybody want to tackle that? How do we do better forecasting of demand? How do we do that holistically in this market across all of the players? Is it about predictive analytics and using past historical data? Is it more feet and boots on the ground to do the ground truthing and the forecasting? Does anybody want to take this and help us figure out how we can answer the question of creating more time and getting more ahead of these demand signals?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, the challenge of identifying MAST in advance of visual observation, botanical, traditional botanical practice is kind of that's the ideal state, right? And nowadays with a lot of like new people coming to the sector, meaning non-traditional practitioners, researchers, scientists, et cetera, I think there's an opportunity to bring in analytical tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence in the way that the biology sector has brought in. So for instance, there are a bunch of scientists and companies and academic groups that are using machine learning to identify how proteins fold, because this is a challenge that scientists around the world haven't been able to figure out because it's a complex mathematics and they're only able to make incremental changes. So for masting, we similarly have patterns that are beyond us and we have limited data sets. So we are modeling some of the data, we are collecting some of the data. So I think there's a real way for us to use some of these black box solutions and link that up with policy initiatives that fund botanists and other boots on the ground observers for presence and absence data to be collected, and for us to get closer to this idea of predictive technologies for forecasting that are beyond just market signals and market communications. So that's kind of the idealistic, ethereal is like, why aren't we attacking this with the same vigor, right? And it may just be an awareness issue and connecting the dots and knowing that academic funding cycles usually lag 10 years behind an idea that happens, among practitioners, right? But for everything else, like for demand signaling, I think part of it comes down to incentive and information. Like people are still out there talking about trillions of trees because our colleague Crowther went out there and made a comment how trillions of trees. I mean, he's since come back and created robust analysis to refine those statements. But like the public does not have an idea of any of the nuance that is being described here in the chat by all these professionals, right? So how can we expect for us to be able to bring in enough people for us to be able to forecast demand at a landscape level, right? So somehow we need to arm people with enough information and then tools to be able to relativize observations, relativize incentives, relativize practice so that we can actually start to look at meaningful impact at a meaningful scale. Otherwise, it's just going to be all of us beating our heads against the wall, trying to fight for the nuance for our particular project, region, or partnership group, right? So really, this is like a social awareness thing, I genuinely believe now.
Right. Thanks, Matthew. I realize we're coming up to time, so I want to be very respectful and very grateful for all of our speakers who have joined us today. Maybe we could just go to the next slide as well. I think we just have a thank you slide there. Eve, Matthew, Eduardo, thank you so much for being here. We really loved your participation and all of your partnership as we've been building over the last 2 years. Our next session is actually on April 24th, I believe, and it is with 3 more incredible speakers. We're looking at rebuilding our relationship with seed. So we'll be chatting with Sephra Alexandra, who is part of the Northeast Seed Network as well, Sean Fox from the Guelph Arboretum, and Alexis Larson from the Institute for Applied Ecology. So we're thrilled to have that happening in a couple weeks from now. We'd love for you to join. Again, all of that registration information is available at seedarc.io. And then also, if you are in need of seed or you are a seed collector, please feel free to download Squirrel today. We are about to open our 2nd season and trying to load as many demand requests across North America into the tool as possible, so that we can start to generate the groundswell of seed collectors to responsibly and ethically respond to those signals. So Thank you so much. This was our first session. Very happy with our incredible speakers and great participation and questions from the audience. And we look forward to speaking with you and being in partnership with you on this journey as we move forward. So thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for hosting, Julian. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
See you guys.
Bye.